There is a lot of writing advice out there, so much so that anytime you have a problem, you can for sure find at least one solution. The problem comes when we try to take this generic advice and apply it to our specific problem, which often creates more problems than it solves. And that's why today I want to give you one simple tool, a single question, that can help you diagnose the problem that you're having and how to move forward without having to wade through all of the internet's advice. Stay tuned. Most memoirs don't stall because of lack of time. Most memoirs stall because of lack of clarity. And that's why I put together the memoir method checklist. The idea here is to give you every single step in the process, not because that makes it easy, of course not, but because no project is ever completed until you know what the steps in the process actually are. You can download it free at pageandpodium.com/checklist. When I started the memoir method, Page and Podium's signature group program for women working on their first memoirs, one of the things I knew for sure was that it was going to be really, really important to take some of the advice that our members would have gathered from the internet in general and help them craft it into something that was individually useful for them. See, the thing that I saw happen over and over again was I was meeting with women outside of the group program, folks who were just coming to me for general advice, and I was hearing the same kinds of things over and over again. Things like, I'm trying to use the hero's journey, it doesn't seem to fit my book, but I'm not sure if there's something wrong with me, or there's something wrong with the advice, or I'm just not applying it correctly. That is a huge question, and no matter how many times I talk about the hero's journey or other structural methods, I will never be able to solve your individual structural problems through a podcast episode. The same thing happens as we move into the chapter writing. I was hearing from so many women who are saying things like, when I write, the words on the page do sound like me, but aren't they supposed to sound more literary? Aren't they supposed to sound more like the books that I read and love, the New York Times bestsellers that I see every single day? And while it's up to you, that's not that helpful of a response. Oftentimes, folks find that they need a little bit more in-depth understanding of the problem to really be able to ask for the advice they need. So one of the things that I thought would be really, really useful, particularly for those of you who are listening to this podcast, watching the YouTube channel, or reading on our blog, but who have not yet taken the plunge to get that expert help that you can get through our programs, I wanted to give you a quick diagnostic tool that you can use anytime you come up on a problem in your memoir. Now, as I'm going to go through when we get to the end of this video, there are all types of areas where this question can serve you. Everything from the development process all the way through marketing and publishing. And keeping in mind that really we are very often just trying to find the place between two polar opposites, a middle ground rather than a black and white, yes or no, perfect or awful type of viewpoint, it can be a game changer. And since our mission at Page and Podium is to help as many women as possible not only write and publish amazing memoirs, but also enjoy the process, grow from the process, learn about themselves and the world from the process, I want to be as transparent as I can. And this is a question that we use all the time to help navigate through specific writing problems that are affecting specific writers. So, without further ado, what is the question that you can ask yourself to figure out how and whether to apply any piece of advice to a particular problem you're experiencing? Well, the question you can ask yourself is, do I need more constraints or do I need more freedom? Now, this sounds like such a generic question, but it can be so helpful when we're really thinking about whether we even need advice at all, let alone whether to take a particular piece of advice that we have read from someone on the internet. But I know I need to go into a little bit of background here to really make sure it's clear why this question packs such a punch. And the way I want to start with that is by first talking about what we mean by constraints, and in the context of writing your memoir, what we mean by freedom. In any creative endeavor, any type of form of expression you might participate in, you are always navigating between constraints and freedom. We just often don't think about them this way, which can create some blocks to trying to solve our specific problems. Again, particularly when you want both an excellent finished product and an enjoyable, memorable experience that helps you learn and grow along the way. Okay, so let's start by getting into what I mean by constraints and why constraints are so useful when we're thinking about our approach to writing any kind of a book, but particularly a memoir. And when we talk about constraints, we are essentially just talking about limitations. But one thing I want to make really clear here is that there are a lot of different places that those constraints can come from. Everywhere from our own self-doubt, which often tells us we must write within a narrow set of expectations, all the way through to the things that we learned as children in our English classes that still haunt us, hang around with us, tell us that we must follow specific rules. Now, when we're thinking about constraints, we're simply talking about the guardrails that tell us, yes, we can do X and Y and Z, but only to the point of A and B and C. Or more often, unfortunately, if you are a high-achieving, recovering perfectionist woman, constraints might sound like, no, you can't do that. But either way, what we are talking about are the things that limit our freedom of movement, that limit the options that we have as we're moving through a book. Remember, as I've talked about in this channel many times, when we are writing a book, we are simply making a series of choices that set up ourselves and our readers to follow through a story that feels like it has movement, it has conflict, it has change, it's taking our reader to a particular point. So when we are thinking about constraints, they are simply a vehicle to limit the number of choices that we have to make. And that can be super useful as you're moving through this process that presents us with a new choice to make, maybe 10, maybe 1,000 every single day we sit down at the computer. Now, on the other end of the spectrum is freedom. Now, oftentimes we think as writers that we really want and need all the freedom. Now, this is particularly true if you are working on something that is a really deeply treasured type of story or memory or lesson, because oftentimes we feel that we want to write the book because we haven't seen a book written like that before. And that tells us, and it's not wrong, by the way, that the way to move forward is to give ourselves the flexibility to do things that are new. By doing things that are new, of course, we are moving away from pieces of advice, limitations, constraints that we might have read about from very credible and, in fact, often correct pieces of advice, just advice that might not fit for us because we're working on something that's a little bit different. When we're thinking about this sense of freedom in writing, there is nothing more important. We need to feel that we can share our story freely, that we don't have to cover over and camouflage our real feelings, that we can use the words, the language, the format that we want to use. We really want to feel like this book is part of us. And oftentimes that means that we are going to need to push ourselves to be a little bit more free. We're going to need to push ourselves out of some of the assumptions about how things should be and into some of the true, authentic feeling of really the flow of those ideas coming out of us without feeling so pinched and trapped and cramped by all of the advice we've read on the internet. So when we think about constraints and freedom, they really are not only opposite ends of a spectrum, they also are companions. As we increase our constraints, we are simultaneously, necessarily, decreasing our freedom. And as we increase our freedom, we are going to have to let go of some of our constraints. So all the time, these two things are working together, helping us to determine as we make each new choice, as we face each new problem, as we come up on each new struggle, we have these two poles that we are balancing to help us both limit the choices that we have so that the choices feel manageable, but also expand our creativity, expand the new kinds of ideas that we have, even if they might not even have been on the board as one of our choices if we were operating under normative constraints. So as we're moving through, we are always navigating these two poles. Even if you have never thought of it before, you have done this. Okay, so when we're thinking about constraints versus freedom, I want to make a couple of observations that are particular to the types of women that we tend to work with, the types of folks that tend to watch this channel. The first one that I want to share is, while it is possible for writers to either have too many constraints and too little freedom, or too much freedom and too few constraints, it is much, much more common, especially for high-achieving women, that you have way too many constraints and way too little freedom. Now, what does this feel like? So you can kind of diagnose whether this is you or not. Oftentimes, what it feels like when we have too many constraints and not enough freedom is that we cannot move forward. Remember what I said, writing is a series of choices. Constraints are necessarily going to limit those choices. And that's a really good thing, because for any given point in your memoir, you have infinite choices. So using constraints to narrow things down is actually very helpful. But if you have too many constraints, what starts to happen is that no choice feels good enough. We have put so many limitations on the choices that we have that we can no longer see that there used to be other options, that actually maybe if we zoomed out, we would find the solution. It's just that we are so dialed in to perfect or good, all of these ways of approaching with black and white thinking that can really, really limit what we're even able to do. And what happens if every time we come upon a choice in our memoir, whether that's structure, whether that's voice, whether that's how to lay a chapter out, what happens when we have too many constraints? What happens when we find that none of our choices seem to match up with what we should do? Well, most people just stop. Most people just put that manuscript in a drawer, move on. They feel a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, a lot of regret. Sometimes we'll pull it out of the drawer every once in a while, but ultimately, it's gonna stay in the trunk, so to speak. As long as we are limiting ourselves so much that we can't move forward, we never will move forward. And unfortunately, most people don't realize that the only issue is they've set too many constraints and not given them enough freedom. The other thing that I see really commonly go wrong with our constraints versus freedom balance is women who will tend to go between the extremes. So this is really common because so many of the women that we work with, so many of y'all watching, I know, are folks who are pretty good DIYers. You have been able to figure things out in the past. You were probably either a pretty good student, or you could have been a good student if you applied yourself. That was kind of me. But either way, you are probably moving through with the assumption that you can probably figure it out. And you can probably figure it out. But the other thing that I find goes hand in hand with that type of experience, that type of mindset, which again, I myself have, is that we will tend to rock between the two extremes. Because we're so used to being able to work through things, to figure them out as we go, we'll often start with a hugely restrictive set of constraints. But because we're smart, because we know how to move forward and get ourselves out of these quagmires, we'll often flip, we'll throw everything out, the baby, the bathwater, all of it, so that we can have the freedom. Oftentimes, this is partly because we feel rightly that we actually need much more room to groove, that we have made this process totally not fun at all by putting too many limits on ourselves. But the problem is, when we move from all constraints, no freedom, to all freedom, no constraints, well, now we have to navigate an entirely different issue. Even if we had been making okay progress, slow, maybe steady, with our constraints, we have no experience operating with no constraints. Well, now we've got to figure out this process again, but with the freedom, no constraints version, and it's not easy either. For those of us that have trouble landing in the middle, for those of us that have trouble not living in the black and white thinking world, not moving toward perfectionist, the pattern is almost always going to be either all constraints or all freedom. And what we really need is some balance in the middle. Okay, there are lots of other ways, by the way, that this balance can go wrong, but those are the two that I see most commonly, and I wanted to shout those out for you in case you see yourself in there. But what I wanted to spend the majority of this video talking about were just some examples of how using this question can be helpful as you move forward through the development process all the way through your publishing and your marketing process. So that said, let's start by talking about how this can show up in development and how asking yourself whether you need more constraints or more freedom can actually help you get unstuck, whether you're using someone else's advice or whether you're just trusting your gut. Okay, so starting with development. Now, when I talk about development, I'm referencing the process that we really strongly advocate here at Page and Podium in the memoir method. This is a big part of what we teach. And this is just the stage that is moving you through, step by step in our group program, by the way, moving you through dialing in your topic, figuring out the most powerful message and how to incorporate it, deciding what all is going to go into your book, organizing it into an arc that feels easy and purposeful and so fulfilling and engaging for your readers, and culminating in a finalized outline that you can get feedback on from 2 professional editors, writers, and publishers, and finally making yourself a writing plan. So that is what I mean when I say development. And the purpose of the development part is to make yourself a plan. Now, what is a plan, if not a set of constraints? But the beauty of moving through a really purposeful development process is that you are building in your own freedom through the constraints that you set. Now, yes, there are some constraints that you would want to follow during the development stage. For instance, every book needs a structure, even if you're seeing it as kind of experimental, say a memoir in essays, you are still going to need to have some kind of structure. That's a constraint. But at the same time, you have a huge amount of freedom as you are making the decision of what structure to use. Now, we have built out our memoir method, our trademarked structure that we suggest that you use in a way that allows both constraints and freedom. We tried to design it to give you both the flexibility to put in what you want, leave out what you don't want, really drive that book toward your message, while also making super sure that you cannot go through the process and end up without a structure at all. We've got to keep that structural constraint. So how do we think about this question? Do I need more freedom? Do I need more constraints as we are in this development stage? Well, I want to give you an example that I hear all the time, actually. And this is about a very, very popular structure called the hero's journey. Now, if you have been exploring, hanging around the internet's advice on memoir, you have no doubt heard of the hero's journey. Now, we have written and talked about the hero's journey many, many times, both on our blog, on this channel, on our podcast, everywhere. And you will know, if you've been watching me long, that I am not a huge fan of the hero's journey. That's not to say it can't work, but what I find is the hero's journey is too many constraints and not enough freedom. In case you're not familiar, the hero's journey is Joseph Campbell's description of narratives that had worked really well in history. He was not writing the analysis of the hero's journey as a prescription for future writers, importantly. Rather, he was describing things that had worked in the past. Now, what this means is, if you are a woman trying to write a memoir that is a topic that has likely not been covered as much as you would like to see, you are going to feel overly constrained by trying to fit your life into each of the 13 steps in the hero's journey. This is particularly true, by the way, for women writers, partly because, of course, what were the stories Campbell was analyzing? They were not women's stories. So when we face the hero's journey, I see so many folks who say, well, I have read that you can't get a book contract if you don't use the hero's journey. Constraint, 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 constraint. But my story doesn't seem to fit the hero's journey. Ooh, freedom going down. So when we ask ourselves, when faced with a problem like that, do I need more constraints or do I need more freedom? Oftentimes the answer there is going to be, we need way fewer constraints. We have got to figure out a way to make the hero's journey work for us, to bring down the constraints of this external idea of the hero's journey and to bring up the freedom of our own story. Until you realize, though, that this is a constraint versus freedom issue, oftentimes what I see women do is try to force their story into the hero's journey. You won't get very far that way. Unfortunately, when we cut ourselves off from the joyful freedom of creative expression, our projects almost always fizzle. We are very, very unlikely even to get to the halfway point if we feel like we are forcing ourselves to write someone else's book. We just lose all sense of connection with our why, and this is too hard of a process to do without a why. So, if we ask ourselves, do we need more constraints or more freedom? We definitely, in that case, need more freedom. And in fact, good news, there are plenty of ways to structure your memoir that do not require you to check in 13 times with Joseph Campbell. Good news, right? Okay, the second place that I see this constraints versus freedom debate come up is when we are talking about our chapters. Now, one of the things that we do in the memoir method, we give you a set of constraints just to get you started. And the way that we do that is we suggest you start by imagining 20 chapters and about 3,000 words per chapter. Now, I am such a math-brained person. I think of everything in terms of these kind of hard and fast numbers. Again, I've often got to dial my constraints down and dial my freedom up. But when we are thinking about starting with a constraint, that 20 chapter, 3,000 words a chapter can be really, really useful just to get you started. But inevitably, we will have folks come back to us and ask us, well, I don't have 3,000 words for this chapter. I don't think it's going to be that long. I guess I could add this and this and this and fill it out, but I think it's only maybe like 2,000, 2,500. Well, there again, you can see if we say, do you need more constraints or do you need more freedom? Inevitably, in that case, we need more freedom. We have put constraints on ourselves to a number of words, but when we cling so tightly to those numbers, we're going to cut ourselves off from what our gut knows. In that case, that this chapter is not supposed to be 3,000 words. It feels right at 2,000 or 2,500. We certainly do not want to lean into the constraints so much that we start adding filler and fluff and stuff that your reader doesn't need or want. Instead, let's dial the freedom up and say, it's actually fine if your chapter is 2,500 words. It's even fine if it's 2,000. Not only do all chapters not need to be the same length, they don't. You also don't even need to hit 60,000. And you know what? The same advice is true if you feel like you need to go over in length. That happens all the time, particularly when we're in this drafting stage, when we're in the stage where we are really trying to move through the weeds to see what the book even is. We almost always need to really keep an eye on that freedom dial. And the reason is, your first draft is not your final draft. Your first draft is going to get everything down in front of you before we move you into the revision process when you have tons of room to move around your freedom and your constraints depending on the bigger picture of your book. So again, in this case, when we're thinking about how long do my chapters need to be, almost everybody I talk to needs a little bit more freedom, a little bit fewer constraints. It is helpful to get started with some loose constraints, some loose rules to follow. But ultimately, we've got to trust our gut. We've got to go with what we know is right. So fewer constraints, more freedom, almost always going to get you through that kind of right or wrong, black or white question. The third place that I see constraints versus freedom come up a lot is in terms of your book's voice. Now, one of the things that I find is really common among women is that while as we write, we do expect our voice to take shape and develop and grow and change, oftentimes I find that women, especially high-achieving women, will expect that their voice should be growing and changing in some particular direction. Now, often what this looks like is some variation of the term literary, which is typically taken to mean smarter or better. Now, I will tell you, in the industry, the term literary as a modifier, a literary memoir, literary fiction, typically means that there is a little bit of experimentation to it, not that it's better. But this is such a common misunderstanding that I really find that literary can itself become a constraint that unfortunately drops our ability to move in freedom through our own expression. And y'all, what can be more important than that our voice sounds like us? Nothing, in my opinion, nothing. So as we are thinking about what should my voice sound like, if what you are hearing in your mind is that you need to sound smarter, you need more million-dollar words, you need longer sentences, that, my friends, is often a sign that you need to dial the constraint down, dial the freedom up. There's a tricky thing that happens when we're thinking about voice, and that is that we can be so certain of where we think we need to go that we forget that where we are naturally going, that where our heart, where our gut is leading us, could actually be 1,000 times better than this should version. It is so common, and I see it all the time, that when we let ourselves go with our gut, when we let ourselves move in the way that we know that feels right, we end up with something that's way, way better than anything we could have modeled ourselves after. But unfortunately, when we keep dialing those constraints up, we need to sound literary, we need longer sentences, we need more vocabulary words. Every one of those needs is dialing down our freedom. And in doing so, we think we're making our book better. We are very, very likely making it worse. So, more constraints, more freedom. I'm kind of a broken record here, but honestly, most women need more freedom, fewer constraints when it comes to voice. Let yourself feel through what it might sound like to really express the authentic message and story you're trying to express, because someone else's version of literary writing may not fit at all. We want to hear from you. Okay, as we are moving forward, I wanted to give a couple of examples that are outside of the actual writing process, since this is something that we help authors with as well. So I wanted to give examples for publishing and marketing to round out our episode. Now, with publishing, I do find that this can be either extreme, and often this is a place that people get really, really lost. Now, if you look back through our catalog, you can do that either on YouTube, on our podcast, or on our blog at pageandpodium.com/blog. You will see that we've talked a lot about how to choose the right publishing path. I believe in my heart that there is no hierarchy of better publishing between traditional book deal and self-publishing and hybrids in the middle. There is no hierarchy there. The thing we need to choose when we're thinking of our publishing path is what will best serve our book. But what I find is that people often have very, very stringent guidelines on their own book of what they will allow to happen with publishing. Now, this can either be, I must get a traditional book deal, or this book is garbage. Too many constraints. When we put that on ourselves, especially when that book deal has to be a Big Five publisher, we have limited all of our freedom, which also means limiting all our availability to see the opportunities. Because very, very often, a traditional book deal might be great, but there are other ways that we could move forward that actually would feel great, that would serve our book so well, that would give us the ongoing support, one-on-one attention that we want. There are so many options here. And the other way that this shows up is that rather than having too many constraints, we give ourselves too much freedom. Now, unfortunately, I do find this often in our podcast audience because we talk a lot about how self-publishing can be just as good as a traditional book deal, how you can self-publish a book that is even better than many of the traditionals. And the hybrids, of course, which is where you are going to put the upfront investment on your book, but still work with a press that is doing all of the labor, all of the organization, all of the distribution. You are seeing those three options, and because there's no hierarchy, you don't have any constraints. Again, I said in the beginning of this video, we don't want too many constraints, but we also can't move forward efficiently if we don't have any constraints. So, in this case, where we are feeling like, I don't know what to do, all three of these paths are just as good. The only way forward is to give ourselves more constraints. But just as I was describing in the development process, just because you're giving yourself constraints doesn't mean you have to give yourself other people's constraints. See what I did there? While it is easy to say traditional book deal or bust, you also might want to say, my constraint is I do not want to go this alone. Okay, well, that does not eliminate self-publishing, unfortunately, but it does eliminate DIY self-publishing. Okay, well, what if you face the choice with just that little bit of a constraint? What does that do for you? You can here again ask, do you need more constraints? Maybe you want to add on there, I'm okay with doing self-publishing, I do need support, and this is the budget that I have. You're giving yourself just nudging up those constraints until you feel empowered to make the decision. So when we think about publishing, constraints versus freedom is actually really, really important, but it is going to require you to step outside of the world of the book, and it's going to require you to think a little bit more about your goals for the entire project and yourself. And that is very similar to how we might think of constraints versus freedom in the marketing realm. Now, what I often hear here is authors trying to say that there's no way they can market the book themselves because they don't have 1 million social media followers. You can hear that this is a very black and white, yes or no, right or wrong, perfectionist attitude, because of course, there are lots of other ways to get into the marketing world. Now, here I find people have too many constraints, but they often also are not very well thought out. Often they are just the type of constraints that are just assumptions, sometimes based on Hollywood or television, sometimes based on friends and family, sometimes based on podcasts, but there are kind of made up constraints. And here again, just as with publishing, we've got to find a way to set constraints for ourselves that actually also serve our freedom. And one of the things I want to encourage you to do as you're thinking about marketing your book is I want you to really think about what would feel good. If we are in this place where we are giving ourselves so many constraints around the idea of marketing, very often we need to dial the constraints down, but before we can add new ones back, we've got to make sure we're in touch with ourselves. So what feels good? Do you like speaking? Do you want to do some public speaking? Do you want to do keynotes? Do you want to do workshops? Do you want to do trainings? Do you like being in front of people? Then let's do that. But what I don't want anyone to do is say, I must do those things, constraint, constraint, constraint. Because maybe rather than appearing live, rather than speaking to groups, your best way forward is to think about getting guest essays posted in different locations around the internet. If you're working on a book that is business adjacent, you might look at Forbes or Forbes Women to submit an article that would help to promote you, and through your article, you can promote your book. Maybe you want to look and see if you can get into some literary magazines to submit some things to see if you can get those printed to help you just build up a little bit of your platform. Maybe you want to create your own blog or podcast or social media series. Whatever it might be, we can always dial up the amount of freedom, but then we need to kind of balance it with constraints, right? What are the goals that you have for your book? How are we going to think about giving ourselves the freedom to do what feels good while also not totally slacking on the job, while also not giving up on our dreams and working toward the goal? Well, ask yourself, do I need more constraints or do I need more freedom? And then dial your approach accordingly. Okay, I hope that this has been helpful, only in that I'm giving you some different examples so that you can take this same strategy back to your own writing problems and really individualize the type of advice you need. But I want to say one more time, we do offer this in our group program. In fact, it's one of the things I'm most proud of. I know oftentimes group coaching programs get a little bit of a reputation for being kind of a cattle call. There's 1 million people in there. Maybe you get to ask a question once a month or two. I have been in programs like that too, friends. When I created the memoir method, I determined that it would never, ever feel like that. So every time you show up to one of those group calls, you are going to be asked to give an update. You have room for your questions. And in fact, we even make sure that we have time to work through some of those questions with you to really help you figure out whether you need more constraints, whether you need more freedom, and how we can actually execute that. In all things, the group program, the podcast, and all of our offers, our main goal is to make sure that our authors come to us and leave more equipped to do things on their own. We want to make sure that you have the tools to move forward, and we've designed our entire program around that. If that sounds good, if you'd like to have somebody that is in your back pocket that is ready to help you decide whether you need more constraints or more freedom and what that might look like, head over to pageandpodium.com/contact. You can fill out a brief form and then schedule a call directly with me. We'll chat through it, make sure that you're going to be such a good fit in the group before we move forward, get you enrolled, and get you in that program. I promise you, it is going to change the way that you are approaching your memoir. It's going to help you enjoy the process so much more while feeling so much better about the product, even as you're moving through the constraints and the freedom of getting that book on the page. As you're moving forward, I hope you are enjoying this process. I hope your memoir is teaching you all kinds of things about life. Keep at it. Let me know if I can help. And otherwise, happy writing. Most memoirs don't fail for lack of time. They fail for lack of clarity, because their author is trying to move forward in a process that is unfamiliar and unclear with no one to support their efforts. And that's why I put together something very practical, the Memoir Method Checklist. This is designed to give you every single step in the process so you not only know what you need to work on now, you know what's coming next, and after that, until you have that beautiful published book in your hands. You can download it now at pageandpodium.com/checklist.